Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 121 of Fracking Nightmare. Now, I think it's been about 3 weeks since the last episode of Fracking Nightmare, and in that episode, number 120, we focused on the events in Groningen in northeast Holland, where we looked at the effects of the abstraction of gas from one of the most prolific gas fields on the Western European continent, and looked at how, after some 30-odd years of abstraction, earthquakes had been triggered, really kicking off around about 10 years ago, to the extent where there have literally been thousands of properties that have been damaged over the last decade. Well, it seems that somebody at Channel 4 may have been watching that program, because, as we'll see later, they picked up on that theme, and earlier this week did a truly outstanding report from Groningen. And of course, as I'm sure everybody watching this is very well aware, Quadrilla currently have their frack pad at Preston New Road pretty much in mothballs. And although they are desperately trying not to admit it, the reality is that every one of their peers within the industry is literally on tenterhooks that Quadrilla are literally about to make sure, inadvertently, that this industry goes nowhere fast, and may indeed actually be literally in the death throes as we speak. So what's occurred in the ensuing period? Well, after or up until the last episode, I think Quadrilla had actually been fracking for about a week. And in the first week, they triggered a number of seismic events. The first one being on the 18th of October. And then all of a sudden, Blackpool took over from Ollerton in Nottinghamshire, and Blackpool became the earthquake capital of the UK. And by the way, this event that you see here at Newdigate in Surrey is one that the unconventional oil and gas industry does not want you to notice too much, because Newdigate, which sits just a little way to the north of the UCOG well site at Horse Hill in South Surrey, that has become the earthquake capital of the home counties. But in Lancashire, from the 18th, Blackpool was getting into the register of the British Geological Survey almost every single day. And then, we come up to November, and the last earthquake that is reported by the British Geological Survey was on the 4th of November. So that was Sunday week ago. And that was registered at 0.7. And that, by my calculation, was the 36th seismic event in Blackpool since the 18th of October. Well, what, of course, had occurred in Blackpool? Nothing other than Quadrilla attempting to frack the geology. But what was stifling them was this: the traffic light monitoring system. One of the proposers of this system was Professor Peter Stiles, who, of course, has more recently expressed his concern about the prospect of fracking in geology that sits beneath the heavily mined coal measures right across the north of England. Well, For the past 6 years, Quadrilla and the rest of the industry have effectively all been bleating and blagging that this was something that they could work with, and the likelihood of them triggering an event above 0.5 was very slim. But if they did, then injection would be suspended immediately. Well, what it didn't actually say was that injection would be suspended for just 18 hours. Well, of course, what was happening was Quadrilla were waiting for the 18 hours, and as soon as the 18 hours was up, they were pretty much hitting the ignition button on the pumps, and off they went again. And so what they've done is they've primed the geology all around the western side of the Preston New Road well site. They've primed it for a very significant event. Now, to the best of my knowledge and from the data that I've seen, at the moment, Quadrilla have yet to get beyond about half the pressure they planned to pump the frac fluids at. They were seeking to pump the fluids to get a full frac at around about 7,000 to 9,000 psi. But they have barely got above 3,000, and I'm guessing that it's around about the 3,000 mark that they are triggering the higher seismic activity, causing them to have to stop work. Well, of course, this hasn't pleased Francis Egan. And here's the headline from Wednesday, 31st of October. Quadrilla says UK fracking rules risk strangling it. The head of the energy company that is seeking to become the first in the UK to start commercial fracking for gas has warned the government that its regulatory system risks strangling the nascent industry. Francis Egan, chief executive of Quadrilla, called on the government to relax operating rules that have forced the company to halt work several times after it unleashed earth tremors at its fracking site in northern England. And of course, he's said elsewhere that he didn't expect the fracking to cause such serious quakes, although this particular quote isn't actually attributed to him. This quote is attributed to Matthew Lambert, the Government and Public Affairs Director at Quadrilla. Now, I doubt very much that Matthew Lambert made that statement without it being sanctioned by Francis Egan. But he went on to say, because we are managing that risk, I don't really accept that we are likely to cause seismicity above that level, an apparent reference to the 0.5 magnitude. And we will not be causing seismicity which will damage property. Well, obviously, now that they've triggered 36 seismic events, they are looking to relax those standards which they were bragging that were gold standards and should be adhered to, and they would have no reason to seek to modify them. But Francis Egan, in a number of interviews now, has been sowing the seeds that the level should be raised to something akin to that which is applied in Canada, in Alberta, where this is the level. So it's not as with the UK. There it's a magnitude 2 can be triggered with no action required. But above, or less than 2, but above 2, it's inform the regulatory bodies, the Alberta Energy Regulator, and then greater than 4, cease operations immediately. And Francis Egan is saying, well, we should be looking at something, like is practiced in Alberta. But of course, as is always the case with the sociopaths, they never tell the whole story. So let's actually take a look at the comparison here. So this is Alberta, Canada. And as you can see, at 640,000 plus square kilometers, it's not a small tract of land. And in fact, when you compare that to the UK would fit into Alberta about 2.5 times. So Alberta is a very, very significant landmass. But let's have a look at the population density of Alberta. But even this doesn't really tell the whole story. The population density of Alberta is 3.7 people per square kilometres. Okay? Sorry, it's 5.7 in Alberta compared to the national average of 3.7. So 5.7 people per square kilometre in Alberta. And the bulk of them, if we go back here, the bulk of those people actually, there we go, the bulk of those people live within this fairly narrow belt about 100 miles or so north of the US-Canadian border. Once you get up beyond Edmonton, you're really right out in the boonies. So, a little bit different from Lancashire. But let's have a look at the comparison here, because in the north of England, we are looking at a relatively compact area that is being targeted very heavily for fracking. But for the moment, we'll focus on the Fylde. So the Fylde is an area of approximately 400 square kilometres. But the population density is somewhat different from that of Alberta. So remember, Alberta was looking at 5.7 people per square kilometre, which is actually showing that Alberta is one of the more densely populated territories. But the population density of Lancashire is 483 people per square kilometre. But then Blackpool gets a special mention because Blackpool, just a few miles to the west of Preston New Road, has a population density of just shy of 4,000 people per square kilometre. So when you're setting a traffic light zone in an area that is effectively a wilderness compared to that which is heavily populated, one can perhaps start to see why the traffic light system is set at such a low level. So just some comparisons here. Alberta is actually 5.2. Canada is actually 3.7. The Fylde Peninsula is 483 people per square kilometre, and Blackpool 3,977. So Francis Egan and others, when you blag that you can function at 0.5, but then because you can't, you seek to raise it to 4, you need to start looking at the bigger picture. Because if you don't, then you can bet your bottom dollar that we will. And just in case you think that Yorkshire is any better, let's take a look at the situation in Yorkshire. So in East Riding, there's a population of 242 residents per square kilometre. And in North Yorkshire, 127. So even in North Yorkshire, which is one of the least densely populated parts of the area that's targeted for fracking, has a population density that is some 5 times that of Alberta. Well, who is it that you're trying to get to raise these standards? Well, this is I won't say the Three Stooges, but could just as well. But, although ultimately, of course, the buck stops with Theresa May, but she's got more than enough bucks to be stopping right now, and the likelihood she won't be in the job for too much longer anyway. But here's the guy who is doing his level best to stay out of the debate. This is Greg Clark, the MP for Tunbridge Wells in Kent, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Now, as I've said many, many times previously, he's a very ambitious politician. He's actually very highly regarded and is seen as having leadership potential at some future date, perhaps in a decade or so. So he is doing his best to stay out of the focus on the toxic fracking debate. So he in a stroke of some brilliance, appointed Claire Perry, who can't get enough of the media spotlight. Well, up until recently. But as Minister of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and of course recently she admitted that she had never actually visited a frack site. And although the Daily or Sunday Mirror, one of the two, actually reported that she had met with a community that was targeted for fracking. But, for somebody who waxes lyrical about the benefits of fracking, it's really quite strange, perhaps, that she hasn't made the effort either to visit a frack pad or to spend any time with the communities being targeted. But Claire Perry has now perhaps realised that she was set up as the sacrificial lamb to protect the career of Greg Clark. So, although her love of the limelight is such that was actually blinding her to the reality and probably a misguided belief that she could actually get this industry established in the UK, but I think she's rapidly realising that this is one hell of a grenade and she's holding it. So she is desperately trying to pass the grenade to Natasha Engel and push Natasha Engel into the frame. Now, Natasha Engel is the failed MP, formerly of North East Derbyshire, one of the safest Labour seats in the country, and yet she managed to lose it because she went against Labour Party policy, which is to reject fracking and to ultimately outlaw it if they get into office. And she decided that she would campaign on a pro-fracking ticket. Big mistake, because she got ejected and Lee Rowley, a young Tory councillor who stood against her on an anti-fracking ticket, was duly elected. Now, Natasha Engel is a sacrifice that nobody on either side of the political spectrum is going to lose any sleep over. Obviously, as far as the Labour Party are concerned, she lost one of their safest seats in the country by going against party policy. So there's no loyalty on their part. And there's certainly no loyalty from the Tory party because obviously she's a former Labour MP. So she can be sacrificed and nobody anywhere in the political spectrum is going to lose any sleep. But of course, being the narcissist that she is, she believes that she can actually drive this industry and get it established in this country. Well, on last weekend, I became aware that Natasha Engel had actually taken the initiative to write to every news editor in the country to effectively discourage them from reporting on fracking-related earthquakes. So on Monday, after my live stream broadcast, I put out a tweet poll. And the question was, how shocked would you be to discover that failed politician, now shale gas commissioner, Natasha Engel, had written to every news editor in the country in an attempt to shut down reporting of fracking-related earthquakes? And out of the 299 people that responded to that poll over 24 hours, you can see that 89% responded with no surprise at all, which is actually indicative of the fact that an increasing number of people from all around the country are realizing that we live in an extremely corrupt society. One that denies that it's corrupt and tries to maintain the moral high ground. But in reality, as soon as you scratch beneath the surface, the corruption is there for all to see. So, having put out that tweet on Monday, imagine my surprise when I see a Twitter post from Kevin Hollinrake, the MP for Thirsk and Moreton in North Yorkshire. And he published, without any comment, but he published the entire letter from Natasha Engel on his website. Well, this was really quite a revelation, and not one that I necessarily expected to see. But I responded by tweeting that North Yorkshire MP Kevin Hollingbrake exposes Shale Gas Commissioner Natasha Engels' abuse of office by publishing her letter to editors requesting that they refrain from publishing articles on fracking-related earthquakes. And of course, I duly linked to the post on Kevin Hollingbrake's website. So, was I surprised when 1 hour later the post had been removed? So thank you so much, Mr. Hollingbrake, for putting that letter into the public domain. Just to let you know that if you hadn't have done, I was going to actually make it public on Wednesday morning after my live stream broadcast, but you saved me that task. So thank you very much for putting it in the domain. And, maybe at some point we will learn why you decided to remove it. So, this letter, and I'm sure the vast majority of people watching this evening have seen this letter, but I will post the full text of this letter beneath the video of this on both YouTube and on Facebook. But let me just give you a couple of tastes of this letter. She opens the letter, "Dear editor, news coverage of earthquakes caused by fracking. My name is Natasha Engel, and I've recently been appointed as the government's new Commissioner for Shale Gas. In this role, I've been visiting groups and residents in areas around the UK affected by fracking applications. I've just returned from Yorkshire and have become alarmed at the effect that the local and national media coverage on fracking and earthquakes is having on people. It's even worse in Lancashire. There is constant coverage of the earthquakes caused by fracking at the Quadrilla site in Preston. Whilst technically true, because even the slightest movement underground is causing an earthquake, it's not what normal people understand by the word." Will you speak for yourself, Natasha? A tremor over 1 mile underground, reading 1.1 in magnitude, on the surface is not only something that can't be felt, it's something that would never be reported if it was caused by anything other than fracking. And she goes on to relate it to quarrying in Derbyshire, and it's really actually quite pathetic. And actually, it's the sort of letter that one would expect to be written by somebody in high school, who'd done some just cursory research. But what it does demonstrate is that Natasha Engel, as the Shale Gas Commissioner, is anything but independent. And she might as well be called the Commissioner for the Oil and Gas Authority, because that's what her role is. Well, actually, her role is to be the sacrificial lamb, so that Greg Clark, Claire Perry, the Oil and Gas Authority, UKOOG and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, can go, "Oh, nothing to do with us, it was her." So Natasha Engel's head will be on the block. But it won't be that simple, because actually we all know that it's Claire Perry and ultimately Greg Clark who are calling the shots. Well, after this massive PR disaster, then the industry seemed to want to go into overdrive. But let's go back to the Channel 4 report on the Groningen earthquakes. Now, I can't show the video, obviously due to copyright restrictions, but I will post the link, and if you do want to get to it before I'm able to post the link, then go to the YouTube channel of Frack Free TV and look at the Channel 4 article. It's about 20 odd minutes that ran on Monday evening. Well, during the course of the feature being screened, there was an interview with this gentleman, Tom Wheeler, the Director of Regulation for the Oil and Gas Authority. And this was a total car crash. I mean, it was clear that the guy was way out of his depth. I mean, he looks like he's just come in from his paper round anyway, but he is actually perhaps a little bit older than he looks here. But what is he? He's a solicitor. And prior to joining the Oil and Gas Authority as the Director of Regulation, he worked in-house as an in-house legal counsel for the oil and gas industry. And he was so far out of his depth, it was an embarrassment. And if this interview was meant to provide confidence to the British public, then, well, it was actually completely the opposite. So do go watch this broadcast from Channel 4. And when you see this interview, I mean, if it wasn't the fact that, you know, these guys are earning an outrageous sum of money, I might actually feel sorry for them. Well, we also learned that the government had commissioned the University of Liverpool to do some comparative tests to give the public some context of what a 1.1 earthquake might feel like on the surface. And Dr. Ben Edwards, who you see here on screen, didn't actually do any better than Tom Wheeler, his counterpart at the Oil and Gas Authority. And so here was Ben Edwards on camera showing that dropping a bag of flour on the floor was the equivalent to Quadrilla triggering a 1.1 earthquake. Well, of course, they are completely missing the point here. It's not about what's felt on the surface, it's what is occurring deep in the bowels of the earth. It was the seismic activity that caused the deformation of the Priest Hall well back in 2011. And we also know that Quadrilla knew they had deformed the well, but kept fracking and triggering more seismic events. And that's what led to the moratorium being put in place from 2011 to December 2012. So here we are, 6 years later, and despite all the rhetoric, obviously no lessons have been learned whatsoever. And Ben Edwards has taken such a slating over this pathetic science, inverted commas, that University of Liverpool have been, for the last couple of days, putting out tweets trying to say, well, you know, we were only commissioned to do one day's work and, you know, just to put it in context. And of course, our experiments don't take into account what happens underground. Well, that's where the focus needs to be. So the bottom line is that this has been a total car crash week for the motherfrackers. And the unconventional gas industry is pretty much dead and buried now, because we all know that having primed the geology, that as soon as you ramp up those pumps, you are going to trigger an event which is going to be of sufficient magnitude that the politicians will have absolutely no choice but to pull the plug. And Natasha Engels, who's only been in the job 5 minutes, so you know she ain't going to be missed, is she? Will be out on her ear. But obviously there'll be a revolving door, and somebody will pick her up and obviously offer her another sinecure position, just to you know, let her keep the wolf from the door. So meanwhile, of course, Natasha Engel is still trying to mount a charm offensive, and it's reported that today, apparently, she was due to go visit the community in Rossiter. And of course, the community in Rossiter are due to participate in a public inquiry, which I think kicks off in January, where the planning inspector will consider overturning the decision of Lancashire County Council and consider actually granting Quadrilla permission to drill another well at Rossiter. Well, it is counter to certainly my counsel that any individual or small group should ever meet with anyone claiming to represent either the industry or the government, because that never ends well. Because unless the event is videoed or recorded, then they have the opportunity to write the press release even before they've left the office. It doesn't matter what happened at the meeting, they can simply issue a press release saying they met with representatives of the local community and allayed their fears. The only time there should ever be any discussion with the industry or with the government representatives pushing this industry is in the public domain, where it can be open to public scrutiny. Certain individuals within the unconventional gas industry spent best part of 2014 and 15 trying to entice me into their offices. Ian, come and have a coffee. Like that was ever going to happen. I would never put myself in a position where they could ever claim that they'd have a discussion with me and allayed all my concerns, because that ain't going to happen. Anyway, we will wait and see how that meeting panned out. And hopefully the residents who did meet with her can get their press release out before Natasha gets hers out. Well, we know that Natasha has met with representatives of pro-fracking groups. And some of those representatives have very kindly posted their reports of their meeting with Natasha Engels on Facebook. And my thanks to Eddie Thornton for putting this into the wider domain. And Eddie writes, if anyone had any doubts about Engels' independence, read this report of the meeting by someone who offered to back her up with a cricket bat. So this is from the pro-fracking group, I believe, Backing Fracking. And the post reads, very fruitful. She seems to be very dedicated to her job, to the point of risking her job to get some action against these protesters. We had to keep the meeting very secret until the last moment to avoid the placard-waving moronic tosspots turning up and gate-crashing the meeting. She's dead set on putting a stop to the bullying and intimidation by the protesters and is well clued up on what they get up to, although she was well shocked at what had been going on at KM8. Well, she was well shocked by the behaviour of the police, because that was the only bullying I saw. It was suggested that various pro-fracking groups get together on this problem. It was also suggested that there is a great urgency for the government, energy companies and local authorities to stop burying their heads in the sand and act against these people in a proper manner. Also, it was suggested that more info be given to the general public on what is happening with the situation and with fracking in general. Well, I certainly agree with that. Natasha also intends to have the scaremongering media looked into over their ridiculous posts. Thus, the letter that I discussed earlier regarding her efforts to effectively put a D notice on editors. Well, here's a couple of the posts that Eddie flagged. One by Neil Milbank, responding to Belagy. For sure, she is not neutral and she's worked in the industry. Yep, she was on the INEOS payroll for a few months. Give her all the info you can. She listens to what we have to say. And elsewhere he writes, she is prepared to take whatever crap they decide to throw at her. Having just spent an hour and a half in her company, she gets my vote, and if she needs backup, I have a cricket bat. So there you go. There you go. That's the level of intelligence adopted by the pro-fracking community. And as you can see, that any discussion of democratic process is completely out the window as the moronic tosspots on the other side of the table feel that this is something that the north of England should be condemned to exploit. Well, ultimately, the anti-fracking community does what it does to raise awareness, to stimulate curiosity, and to encourage people to do their own research, which is something you will never, ever hear the government, the industry, or the pro-fracking community ever say, because they know fine well that once people do start to do their own research, then if they are objective, then they will realise that this is an industry that has absolutely no place in a densely populated country like the UK. Well, Ultimately, other forces, of course, come into play. And what's really interesting right now is that the arch corporatist Donald Trump may actually be wielding the sword of Damocles over the unconventional gas industry in the UK, because what is coming, what has already started, is the oil price crash of 2018. And I predict that we're about to see a fall in prices very similar to that which we saw in 2014, which ultimately saw the price of a barrel of oil drop briefly down below 30 bucks a barrel. Now, just a few weeks ago, Brent crude was trading at nearly 80 bucks a barrel. But here's a report from oilprice.com. I believe this was actually published today. Relentlessly rising American oil production, primarily due to fracking, coupled with the US granting waivers to 8 Iranian oil customers, including Tehran's biggest clients, China and India. So Trump hasn't exactly issued blanket sanctions, but added to oversupply concerns on the market. On the demand side, the US-China trade war has been hurting global economic and oil demand growth prospects. All these factors combined, along with US President Donald Trump's latest tweet aimed at OPEC, where he said, hopefully, Saudi Arabia and OPEC will not be cutting oil production. Oil prices should be much lower based on supply. These were the reasons behind the oil price plunge into a bear market. The oversupply in the market is a made in America phenomenon, Morse told Bloomberg. It's the unexpected consequences of American policy and the unintended impact of technological changes that made this historically unprecedented arena for production growth blossom. So, let me explain what's occurring here. Trump, following on from Obama, obviously has pushed the oil and gas industry in the US. So the US now is producing more than it can consume, and it needs to create overseas markets. So one of the primary reasons for sanctioning Russia, Iran, and Venezuela is to make it difficult for them to export their oil and gas. And what he's hoping is that those countries who can therefore no longer purchase oil or gas from these countries due to the sanctions will purchase it from the United States. Well, this is just so incredibly naive, because the bottom line is that ultimately people want to purchase something that is as close to home as possible. Now, the UK does not import any Russian gas to date, but Germany gets about 60% of its gas supply from Russia. And so Trump is deliberately trying to replace the Russian supply with a US supply. But, when there's an existing pipeline from Russia to Germany, are you going to buy it through that or from the virtual pipeline of having to ship it across the Atlantic? It's a no-brainer, really. So anyway, what we're about to see is all hell break loose, prices plummet, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. I don't think it's going to go down to probably 30 bucks a barrel, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see the price drop down again to below 40, because the OPEC countries will want to see, once again, at what point the US unconventional hydrocarbons industry is not viable, and therefore production is clawed back. So this is what ultimately is more than likely going to actually bring an end to the viability of unconventional hydrocarbon abstraction in the UK. Here's what we've seen. This is from January of this year. So what we're seeing is prices having got up to, mid-70s. This is West Texas crude. Mid-70s, Brent was, I think, just a little bit over 80, in fact. But having got up to just mid-70s, look at what's happening, and it's now down to the mid-50s and is likely to continue to fall thanks to Trump's aggressive policies of putting sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. So, all to play for. Here we are. It's nearly 6 years. In fact, it's 6 years less 1 month since the moratorium was lifted in this country. And although last year, Third Energy were expecting to be the first company to frack in the UK, of course, they were run out of North Yorkshire because ultimately their accounts didn't stack up, as many had been telling for some time. Now it's supposed to be Quadrilla, but Quadrilla know very well that there's no possibility of them getting production volumes out of the Bolan Shale without triggering very significant seismic events. And anytime you hear Francis Egan or anyone else talk about raising the traffic light level, then talk about population density. Because, you know, it's one of the things that we in the anti-fracking community have been pointing out consistently for the past 6 years, that this country has a population density way in excess of any other location that is being fracked, whether it's the US, Canada, Australia. Nowhere are they fracking under a population density like we have in the UK. So it ain't going to happen. You know, I think that there's a very good probability that Jim Ratcliffe of INEOS is already starting to look elsewhere. I think his dream of being able to get his cheap feedstock for his production facilities in Falkirk and on Humberside and on Merseyside, I think he's realizing that this is a non-starter. And rather than throw any more money after it, it's better just to focus on other lines of supply. And today, I've recently learned that in East Yorkshire, the East Riding Planning Committee voted narrowly by 6 votes to 5 to grant Rathlin Energy an extension of their well site at West Newton. But the reality is that Rathlin are only really trying to hang on to it so that they have it as an asset. Rathlin aren't going to be going back there anytime soon, despite their claims that they've sorted out all their financial issues, but without actually providing the evidence of that. It's purely to keep the asset on their books so that in the event of a buyer coming along, they can sell it as an asset. In reality, it's a liability. So we've got to keep the pressure on. I think that by absolutely no later than Easter of 2019, there's so much that's going to change. I mean, hey, listen, we could have a general election within the next couple of weeks, and there's a very real possibility of Jeremy Corbyn getting into number 10 if that happens, and in which case then obviously, you know, the pressure is going to be on him to live up to his promise to shut down fracking in the UK. But even if there isn't a general election, circumstances are going to contrive to force this industry to just close down and walk away. And who knows, maybe Claire Perry can salvage her political career, but only if she holds her ground and keeps the traffic light system where it is right now. Anyway, that's enough of the synopsis for today. And I will be back on Monday. No live stream broadcast tomorrow morning, but I will be back on Monday morning at 8:30, when in fact I will be outside Southwark Crown Court, where I will be supporting David Noakes. And if you want to know more about who David Noakes is and why I will be at Southwark Crown Court, then please take a look at tonight's episode of Humanity versus Insanity, which was episode number 111. Meanwhile, you have a great weekend. Keep doing what you're doing. And I'm not going to make any mention about Nottinghamshire because obviously that's an ongoing issue. I should be back in court in London in mid-December to challenge the iGas injunction. And believe you me, I think we have some very explosive issues to present to the court at that hearing. But hey, no more of that. See you on Monday morning at 8:30. You have a great weekend.